Hey, your company assessing its climate risk? In this episode, I'm talking with Guoda, who's part of the sustainability team of Deloitte and who's focusing on assessing companies' climate risk. So if this sounds interesting to you, definitely check out this episode. Hey, Guoda, and thank you so much for taking the time. For those of the listeners that don't know you yet, can you tell us a little bit about what yourself and what you're doing?
Hey, Daniel. Thank you so much for inviting me. Currently, I work at Deloitte. Deloitte is, I could even say, a global consultancy and audit and tax um, services providing company. And I work in sustainability services or sustainability service line. And we help companies with everything related to sustainability. So it could be very practical things like CSRD readiness or regulation compliance, could be reporting or strategic level discussion, could be GHG emission calculation, but also climate risk evaluation.
Okay. And how did you get into this position? Were you working with sustainability before working at Deloitte, or how did it develop for you?
So I'm working in sustainability for quite a while, for over 10 years. And
Hmm.
it's been very interesting because I get to see the evolution of the area from very sort of corporate social responsibility, very narrow focused, into a much wider range nowadays with the regulations. It's much, maybe even more clear, but also a more developed as an area of work. So, and I did work before in sustainability, so I have quite a few positions as sustainability manager. But my sort of main first original background is actually non-governmental organization.
Super interesting. And where did the interest for you already like over 10 years ago come from? Because I feel like during the last 5 years, the topic picked up a lot and now there's a lot more focus on it. But
hmm
I think 10 years ago, it was not that much so the case. So how, why did you decide back then to like, this is your field where you want to help?
So when I started working for NGOs, I did a lot of as we would classically now classify, a lot of social topics that fall under the sustainability level. So representation, diversity, right, inclusion. And at that moment, the company that I was about to work for, they were looking for someone who has a good understanding of those topics. So that's how I kind of started on, and then it simply developed onward. So it sort of grew together with the topic.
Nice. And you already mentioned some of the topics that Deloitte is working on. What is your specific area of focus? Like, how can we imagine your day to day as like sustainability focused in Deloitte?
That is a very good question. So as a consultant, it's a completely or a bit of a different topic that we typically as sustainability managers would have inside the company, right? So that would mean that I get to work on a lot of topics and a lot of different companies within the wider sustainability area. And then it's a kind of wide open slate. So whatever the company would kind of need, then we would provide together with a bigger team, right?
And how would you say did the demands from company shifted since the CSRD is launched or has been announced? Like, did you realize a shift in what companies are now asking for, or how is the comparison like before and now with the CSRD?
Well, I think the CSRD is, of course, nudged a lot of the companies that would also see complete compliance issues, right?
Mhm.
So there is definitely an uptake and an interest into the area, and it's motivated by different things, right? So some companies do generally have a business model that relies on sustainability, or others simply then find the area of compliance as a very valid argument to start to work in it. And that also gives a lot of synergy. So once you start exploring your different metrics, you can easily find ways to improve it, right? So business sense could then follow from something as simple as a reporting exercise or investigating the data that you have.
Yeah, very interesting. Earlier, you already mentioned the topic of climate risk, and I would be super interested to learn a little bit more about that. Can you maybe paint a broader picture of like what are climate risk in general, and like how does it relate? Like how do you work with that topic in general?
Yeah, so climate risk is a very broadly defined area, right? If we look at it from a very simplified perspective, so climate risk would typically divided into two main parts, right? So one could be physical climate risk, so something that we can easily sense and feel, right? Could be acute, so something that happens suddenly, like flash floods, right? Could be I don't know, storms, could be something that we don't anticipate in terms of happening, right? And then you
Hmm.
have something that is more chronic, so it's something that develops over time. So change like participate per oh, this is always a difficult word. Precipitation patterns, right?
Yeah.
Could be temperature fluctuation, could be something that we don't necessarily feel day to day, but we see that in the data and the scientific realm that it is changing, right? Which then naturally has an effect on the sort of physical environment that we function in, as people as companies of state. And then we have something that is called transitional risk typically. So transitional risk could be political or legal, right? So a very good example is the CSRD that enables us or commands that we would report on sustainability or non-financial data in a unified way, right? We have technological risk, which means that especially if we talk about the green transition, right? So something that relies heavily on coal, let's say, or other um, or polluting substances that would be sort of outlawed or that would not be in demand, right?
Hmm.
We could see that the reputational risk is there because the demands are changing, and if we don't comply with the regulation or if we don't implement the changes fast enough in terms of adapting to or mitigating climate change from the company's perspective, then we suffer. You know, the consumers look elsewhere, and the last thing we can do is market, right? So market risk as well. That different stakeholders within the market, they look for solutions that are better, maybe for more innovations, and the sort of it changes toward shifts from our produce or services if we don't also make changes. So we're at risk.
Yeah. I think from a company perspective in general, it makes sense to look at the risks that they have, like for any good business. But how are the climate risk now embedded in the sustainability reporting? I know that you already mentioned this a little bit, but maybe can you touch on this again, that you explain a little bit like how are the sustainability reportings now including sustainability risk?
So I think the current development or the widening of the scope of what companies have to consider in the sustainability area is the widening to an extent that they not only have to think about the impact that they produce, right, how they interact with the environment, but also they have to think about risk. And that is very clearly risks and opportunities at the same time. So it's clearly stated both in terms of CSRD or for ESRS, the standard, right? But also other legal acts like taxonomy, right? It also asked companies to evaluate risks or have they evaluated risk relating to their activities that they want to claim under the taxonomy. So So that dimension is quite covered in the legal basis as well. But
Mhm.
you are correct in a way that it does make business sense. And in an ideal scenario, the company would integrate climate risk, maybe in a wider also sustainability risk, and then even in wider company risk management process. So it doesn't live on its own, so to speak, right? It has to kind of find an organic way to inform decisions for the company, whatever those decisions might be. Could be strategic level, could be investment level, something that would, inform their day to day, make their resources focus. So that's the primary focus of risk evaluation.
Yeah, I completely agree that this is like already like an important topic, and I think like with the sustainability reporting, it now will like increase a little bit even more in importance. One interesting thing you just mentioned were then the part of opportunities. So climate risk always also come with opportunity. Can you explain what are like climate opportunities, or what can one understand under that?
Yeah, so opportunities are also, I think, once we risk are typically we think when we think about risk, we think about some negative issues that we have to monitor, right? So something that poses a threat. But at the same time, changing demands, changing conditions, they provide opportunities for of different levels. So could be to develop a new product or a new service, right? Especially could be that the demand would rise and you would change a way of working, right? So efficiency or some way that you can really meet the demand much better. So of course there are fewer opportunities than there are risks typically, but at the same time the company should have an idea of where it can develop and what kind of benefits it can reap, even though the process of climate change is typically framed in a negative way, right? If I
Yeah,
in terms of, for example, Lithuania, since the climate is getting warmer, of course it has a lot of negative effects, but you never know, we might start growing wine, right, or producing wine because the
yeah,
climate is improving, right? So for companies that deal in, for example, beverages, or I don't know, if we start growing oranges, also good, right? So that is an opportunity that they can also reap.
yeah. Very interesting. Excuse me. There's also a term that I came across, which is like basically like a climate risk equation or something like that. Can you tell us a little bit about what this looked like and how this is connected to the whole topic?
Yeah, so I think that naturally, we typically also tend to quantify things, right? Or to put it in a measure that would help us prioritize certain things. So we'd have to have some elements that would help us decide which risk is bigger, greater than the other, right? And for that, the climate risk evaluation equation is something that you can use, right? So it typically has three main elements. Element number one is sort of a hazard, or the probability of something happening, right? Or the severity of something happening. Could be if you see that increasing levels of really damaging storms, right? Or the company is really exposed to that kind of risk, then it will be high, right? The second important element is the exposure, as I just also mentioned. So the exposure in terms of value or cost, how much damages can it make? And the third important element is the vulnerability, right? So how easily can I continue working even though something has happened, right? Or how easily I can withstand the damage that has been done, right? So to illustrate very simply, if we have two factories on the same river bank and one has invested into flood mitigation or into protection against heavy snowfall and the other has not, so their risk will not be the same, right? But also
Mhm.
their tolerance of risk can be different. So let's say one company will accept a higher risk because they have another 5 factories working where they can shift their services or production, and the other has none to kind of substitute. So those are the kind of different considerations, even though the conditions could be very similar, but then the risk
Hmm.
is very different.
Okay. So uh, in a real example, those companies could then use the equation to see like what is their climate risk factor, and then based on the equation help the decision making, or how would companies usually implement such an equation into their management?
So, for example, you would need to evaluate the factory's risk, right? And you would go through the different acute or chronic or transitional risks. You would identify that for yourself. You would see which risks cause the most damage or where you are the most vulnerable or what is the kind of the biggest hazard that you have. And then this exercise helps you sort of focus your resources in terms of what I need to do in order to make the situation better, right? How I can mitigate and how I can adapt and how I can implement measures to not be as vulnerable, right? So you could say that if you found that you have a very big dependence on a particular resource, like a factory, and you know that you haven't done anything, but you increasingly see that there's different climate weather patterns that are causing you damage, which means that eventually something is going to go wrong and you will suffer a lot of losses, meaning that you
Hmm.
have to improve your situation. And that helps you as well argument why you're doing certain things, right? So also
Yeah.
could be very simple as a strategic exercise, right? You're trying to think about the future and in a long term, and typically climate risk does develop over longer periods of time, so it's a useful input of information for strategic consideration, right? If you think about developing a power plant that would deal in, well, I don't know, solar energy and a power plant that would deal in coal, you can sense, right, that there are some risks involved in either one of them, right? So that means that helps you also get an extra dimension of what is happening in sort of the surrounding area, the community, the state, where it's going.
Yeah. Okay. And what would be other challenges that companies have or in relation to the climate risks?
Well, I think in terms of climate risk, challenges are sometimes to, well, depends on the maturity of the company, right? If the company is very used to doing risk evaluation, right, or risk management is integrated into the work of the company, then this process comes a bit more naturally, right? So that means you integrate simply an extra dimension where you consider a certain set of factors and you see it from a different angle. If the company does not have this integrated already into their everyday working, then it's a bit more difficult to grasp the concept and how it is useful for me, right? Whether it's just not a theoretical exercise. So I would
Hmm.
say the biggest kind of drawback or the biggest challenge that companies face is exactly understanding that this is an exercise that is useful in evaluating their vulnerabilities, their dependencies on resources, because we in this globalized supply chain or value chain world are dependent not only on our immediate environment, but also
Yeah.
other regions. And then climate change or climate change risk manifestations can easily cascade through the systems and through networks and through countries, right? So they have no borders. So if you're dependent on a very particular resource, well, let's say coffee from coffee growing regions, and
Hmm.
then your suppliers are swept away by a drought or a flood, that means you have nothing to produce coffee from, right?
Yeah.
And that already kind of gives you an idea that you might be vulnerable to something bigger than your immediate operation.
Yeah. What do you think that, because I feel that I talk to quite a lot of companies that are now, because of the CSRD, looking for the first time at sustainability reporting. And I would assume if they have not done any sustainability reporting, they have also not really looked at their climate risk. So what do you think are their challenges that they will face in looking at this for the first time and like try to get into it without any previous knowledge?
Well, I think that if they're just starting their sustainability journey, right? So climate risk will not be part of or kind of an immediate priority, right? So I think if they're looking at CSRD level of reporting, then they most likely will start from double materiality, and they will go into topics that are relevant for them, kind of prioritize. And if they go for a strategy level discussion, right? What are
Mhm.
our final priorities or where we need to invest? That could be a moment to consider climate risk or even a wider sustainability risk evaluation, right? Sustainability risk evaluation would simply mean you also add a lot of the social and the government dimension to the analysis, which companies typically already to some extent do if they do risk management, right, in their inside. Another point where they can consider climate risk would be potentially after they have done already some level of reporting, they have gathered information, and then they want to go in deeper as well, right? So that would also be a useful exercise when they see, okay, this is the things that are material. We see that this has an impact, right? We see that we're dependent on our value chain elements. We're dependent on something that would benefit from a climate risk analysis to see what is the best investment to make, right? So whether we need to um, reinforce our infrastructure, whether we need to kind of spread out the supply, right, that we get from our suppliers. So those are useful at business level operation consideration.
Okay. And what would be some of your recommendations for companies that now have to face like climate risk assessment, whether it be for the double materiality aspect during the CSRD or also when it's for more strategic level later on? Like, what would you recommend those companies, or what could be like helpful for them to know when they have to go through that process?
Well, I think climate risk and in general sustainability is a good area because it gets a lot of people to the table, right? If you
Mhm.
want to make good climate risk assessment or you want to go in deeper into kind of sustainability level vulnerabilities, then you have to have people from a very technical part of the business, from procurement, from legal, from HR, right, from risk management if you have some, and that gets you talking about variety of aspects that typically you don't necessarily think about in your everyday function, right? It informs company decisions. So it's also a good information exchange or where we are, what our vulnerabilities are, which then the HR person can take, okay, we need to hire with certain skills in mind, right? Or certain things will have to be developed. Then the operations people could say, okay, this is something that we need to tackle in terms of infrastructure or our future plan. And so it kind of develops into this much wider conversation within the company. So that is, that's why I think discussing risks and climate risk in particular is a good way to kind of get everyone on board into sustainability.
Yeah, I definitely see how that's a connection point between like the sustainability reporting, like the CSRD, and then a wider prospect of like different topics that are relevant to the company in general, but then also, yeah, to like super valuable to like a lot of people that are affected by those. So I definitely see this as a very interesting connector. Are there any other particular recommendations that you would want to give to a company that, let's say, they have like a meeting next week about their sustainability reporting and they also need to include the climate risk? And how would you recommend them to like approach it, or what would you want to give them with them for the next meeting about the topic?
Well, I think the first step would be to see whether kind of well, anyone in terms of risk management have tackled anything in there. So if they haven't tackled anything in terms of climate risk, then it would be good to get people onto a table and start discussing the different aspects. I think there are quite a few publicly available frameworks that help you to get into the topic, and especially the TCFD, that also I think are the most widely used framework for evaluating climate risk and for working with the topic. So that could be a good starting point for a discussion and for getting into the topic.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds yeah, super interesting. Thank you so much for your input so far. Do you have any other topics that I might have forgotten to ask, or where you think that is relevant to mention right now?
I think maybe my last remaining remarks would be
Mhm.
that uh, that climate risk is a good process that has no time frame, right? So that means that you can start doing this now and continue going as deep as you want. You can also then do in terms of deeper analysis and activities depending on the sector. You can do either stress testing. You can also do sort of a very high level and long term analysis of your assets and resources if you have something like power plants or like plants in general, right? Production, depending on produce, right? So, for example, farming could really benefit from having a deeper look in terms of how the sector will change, how the conditions will change. I think it is also a good idea to talk to external stakeholders, especially it could be people working in public organizations, institutions, or NGOs that work with these wider topics to get input, right? Because I
Mhm.
don't think we expect that we will always know everything 100%. So it's always good to get resources and get ideas from the outside, right? And that also informs the discussion, that informs the knowledge base of the organization, maybe even provides ideas for the opportunities that are ahead. So kind of expanding your external network is also valuable in this case.
Yeah. No, I really like the idea. I think it's such an important topic in regards to the sustainability reporting, but also in a more broader sense. So yeah, I think it's really important that companies look into that and connect with others to see how to improve on that. And yeah, I totally agree that we will never be able to know everything ourselves, but hopefully with knowing enough people, we can then cover the relevant topics.
Yeah. Also, maybe one last thing that I want to
Hmm.
add, that in a lot of senses, I see that climate risk is framed in a very sort of singular perspective, that it is about the environment. But in reality, it also has a lot of social impact, negative impact. So it does we do live in an interconnected world where, then
Hmm.
livelihoods are affected, which essentially means that, state finances are affected, and it all just rolls into this big snowball. So what I would also encourage people or companies not to see it in a very isolated way, but to really feel it as if a ecosystem of these impacts are developed.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I hope that through measures like the CSRD, more companies are gonna like start looking at this in this type of way and are then more actively like working on those topics. Okay, thank you so much for taking the time. It was really a pleasure. I hope we can talk very soon.
Thanks so much. Bye.
Bye.